So Stephen, what brings you to Sibos this year?
I am here to give a talk that I just delivered, and I'm really excited. This is actually the first time I've ever been to Australia, and it means that I've been to all 6 main continents besides Antarctica as of this trip, so it's a big milestone for me.
Fantastic. Now you've just come off stage. Can you tell us a bit about your talk on stage?
So I was talking about a piece that I wrote earlier this year about the blockchain revolution for the Times Magazine. And in the piece I was trying to argue that, in a sense, one of the things we really realized over the last 2 or 3 years is that there's some fundamental problems with the architecture of the internet. And I set out in investigating for this piece to try and figure out how we would fix these architectural problems with the internet, some of which involve identity. And increasingly, the more I dug into it, the more people I talked to, I began to realize that the kind of distributed ledger approach of the blockchain might actually be the one possible way that we could fix these problems with the internet. And so I've become kind of an evangelist for this idea, and so I was sharing some of my thoughts about that and trying to explain why, despite all the craziness and despite all the hype, there is something fundamentally really powerful here that may be central to our future by the year 2030.
Sure. So do you think the application in blockchain spans over every single industry?
I think in a way that, and this took me a while to get to this, that we should think about the blockchain as being an equivalent technology to the internet or the web itself. It is a very low-level idea, and anything that involves networks and value and identity, potentially, if it goes well, will involve blockchain-related technologies, 5 years from now or 10 years from now. Just as anything today that involves information or value or identity almost inevitably involves the internet in some form. I think you'll see that same level of ubiquity. It won't just be about currencies. It won't just be about ways of assigning value to things. It'll be much more about, I think, actually about identity and social networks.
So you think over the next 10 years, the blockchain will be something really fundamental for all of our lives?
I think it is the best case scenario that we have right now. It's possible that it won't work in the end. It's possible that the existing architecture that we have of the internet right now is just too entrenched, and we won't be able to kind of sub in some of the new technologies and approaches that the blockchain offer. It's hard to tell, but right now it reminds me very much of kind of a formative moment when I was in my early 20s, when I first saw the World Wide Web in 1993, and I was like, okay, this is what we've been waiting for. Like, this is the platform that can actually unify all these different networks and solve problems that we didn't have in the early days of AOL and CompuServe and all these kind of local kind of bulletin board services and stuff like that. I remember that sense of like, this is clearly the future. I feel the same way about the blockchain. That doesn't necessarily mean that the best technologies, the best platforms don't always win out. That's why I think it's important to, 1, fight for it, 2, get people to understand why it's important, like what specific problem it is actually solving, because I think that's often misunderstood.
You mentioned that the best technologies don't always win out. Where do you see the real risks lying with the blockchain in the next kind of 5-10 years? My
biggest hope for the blockchain is that, and this is what I was talking about today on the stage, is that using the blockchain we can create an open standard that defines our identity, that individuals would control rather than Facebook controlling or LinkedIn controlling or Google controlling. And in a sense, we would kind of flip the model of identity. We'd create what they sometimes call self-sovereign identity. And that problem that we face right now emerged because we didn't build identity into the original protocols of the internet or the web. There was a way of defining a page of information and a link from one page to another, but there was no way to define a person. And so private companies like Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn swept in and kind of solved that problem using these closed source kind of solutions. And I think that served us well for a while, but we've begun to see the problems with it. It creates a whole number of headaches on a lot of different levels in terms of privacy, in terms of control over our attention, in terms of manipulation, all these things we've seen in the last few years. So my hope is that the blockchain will solve that problem. But Facebook is a big company. It may well be that we're too far along that path of having our identity defined by these closed protocols that are owned by privately held companies, or public companies, but private firms. And we just won't be able to flip the model, which I think would be a shame, but I think we have to face the fact that that also is a possibility.
Yeah, sure. And what do you think of the event this year?
I think it's been great. I mean, it's funny, I've spent so much of the last 9 months since the piece came out talking kind of about decentralization and talking about these new possibilities. So it's really exciting to walk into a room and everybody's talking about it. I feel like you can really see, just walking around these spaces, the critical mass that is starting to form around some of these ideas, which is interesting because there's very little actual consumer adoption of blockchain right now. I often talk to groups and I'll be like, how many of you have actually performed a real transaction using a cryptocurrency, for instance? And it's like 2% of the room in all these places. And so I think this is a very forward-looking group because they're obviously like onto something that is, it's almost like where we were in the web in 1992 or 93. You can sense that something big is happening, but it hasn't fully happened yet. And so it's great to be in a room with so many people who are engaged in thinking about the future.